Welcome to episode 64 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes. Now, if you were listening to this podcast way back in May of 2021, episode 32, so exactly halfway between the start of this podcast and now, so episode 32, you would have heard a monologue, a 5-minute monologue recorded by somebody called Laura Massey-Pugh. At the time, she was planning to cycle around the world on a tandem with her partner Stevie, and she wanted to break the world record. In this episode of the podcast, number 64, we're going to hear again from Laura talking about how she got on. But before we do that, here's the 5-minute monologue that she recorded back in May of 2021.
Hi, my name's Laura and I'm the back half of Stella Tandem, a record-breaking attempt to cycle around the world in 2022. My front half is Stevie, my husband, and we met at a beer festival. He was drinking the beer and I was serving it. While we were there, he told me he'd cycled the length of the country from Derby to Land's End to John O'Groats and back again in 9 days, just over. I barely believed him at the time, but then he invited me to go on a tandem ride with him, and the rest is history. Since then, we've become involved in the wonderful world of Audax long-distance cycling, which you may be aware of. Events are held all over the UK and in Europe as well. We've cycled through Wales, the Pennines, Lake District, all sorts of different places on the tandem bicycle and on solo bikes, culminating in the epitome of Audax, Paris-Brest-Paris, a 1,200 kilometre bike ride from the capital city to the coast and back again. I completed this ride on my own solo bike in 92.5 hours, just outside the time limit, but an amazing achievement and certainly proof that I don't have my feet up on the back. We've also done a lot of touring. We've travelled in the south of France and climbed Ventoux, the Alpe d'Huez, with our fully laden tandem bicycle, camping along the way. On our first trip, we had a small misdemeanor with our route, where the bike bus we were due to get back was not quite in the position we expected it to be, and we were left trying to ride 600 kilometres in about 30 hours. This didn't pan out so well, and it resulted in us having to reassess our options. And we sat there one cold morning thinking, how on earth are we going to get this bicycle back home? The obvious answer was to ride it. So managing to scrape a few more days together, we got on the bike and started riding north. We'd been dropped off at Narbonne on the south coast and already made it part of the way up the country, but managed to ride the rest. And a few days later, we were flying down to Calais at 5 o'clock in the morning to catch the ferry back to the UK. It was a fantastic trip and we had so many amazing experiences along the way, meeting locals and eating the food, drinking the wine. It really imbued in us the kind of spirit of long distance cycling and touring. Last year, we were immensely lucky to be able to squeeze in a lead jog amongst the coronavirus pandemic. Averaged about 100 miles a day, camping again along the way with everything we needed on the bike. Seeing the country at the speed of a bicycle was an absolutely epic experience. And we learnt so much about ourselves along the way on that trip too. Managing to feed ourselves, fuel ourselves and keep the pedals turning all the way until we're stood at John O'Groats on the seafront. This trip inspired us and really made us think about how far can we go on this bicycle. And hearing about Tandem Wow, the two amazing ladies who came in just before lockdown, having broken the world record for the female tandem pair to cycle around the world, we were inspired and we thought, I think we can do this too. So the seed was sown and we started to look at the journey. 18,000 miles around the world, hopefully in 180 days. That will be an epic achievement. lots of people have said, why don't you go slower? Why don't you take your time and enjoy it? But to be honest with you, I've wangled about as much time off work as I can. And one day we will go back and do it slower. But for now, it's about the challenge. It's about can we do this? A lot of people have said, why are you doing this? And I said, because we can. But Stevie has put it even better and said, because we think we can. That element of challenge is still there. We've been inspired by Mark Beaumont, Jenny Graham, Tandem Wow, all sorts of people along the way. And we want to inspire others too. We want to take people around the world with us. If people can follow us and maybe be inspired to go on trips, tours, even shorter bike rides of their own, that would be an amazing thing.
And here we are, back in 2023, and here's my chat with the woman herself, Laura Massey-Pugh, post-trip. Congratulations, Laura.
Hi, thank you so much. And it's great to be back to speak to you again. It feels like a long time since I recorded that snippet.
Well, yeah, you recorded that at the beginning of May 2021. You set off at the beginning of June 2022. So you came back on the 1st of December 22. You broke the world record. You did it in, if my maths is correct, exactly 180 days?
Yeah, it was 175 days, 12 hours and 25 minutes is the time we're hoping to be verified at, yes.
Were you actually setting a record or were you breaking a record?
So Guinness differentiates between the male record, the female record, and the mixed record. So the male and female records already exist, and the female record is the fastest with 263 days. Once verified, we'll be setting a new mixed record. So nobody has before held a mixed record. And then ours would be the fastest overall, but they do differentiate. So it's quite nice in a way that the women especially keep theirs and that the tandem men keep their record as well.
Just to put it into perspective, Rachel Marsden and Catherine Dixon, who were the two women who made up Tandem Wow, who did appear on this podcast, episode number 30, if you want to go and listen to them, they set the women's record at 263 days, and they finished just before lockdown in March 2020. You have set a record of 175 days, which is a significant difference. What's the men's record?
Oh, now you're asking. I think Tandem Wow have got about 2 weeks on the men's record off the top of my head, and I think they came in about the same time. I think that there've actually been two male record holders. So the most recent ones were riding around the same time as Tandem Wow, I think. And I think Tandem Wow did very well to pip them to the post. And I think it's about 2 weeks that they've got on the men. I might be wrong, but off the top of my head, that's the figure I've got in mind.
So basically, you and your partner Steve, you have the record, irrespective of whether it's male, female, having done it in 175 days, has smashed both the men's record and the female record.
Yeah, so we'll be the fastest overall, hopefully. We're still pending verification from Guinness, so hopefully I'm not jinxing myself and it all goes smoothly. But we believe, we've been very adamant to follow the rules and collect all the evidence, so hopefully everything should be well in order there.
So you were aiming to go 18,000 miles around the world in 180 days. Now, my calculations make that about 100 miles a day or 160 kilometres per day. That is quite a challenge. When I've been cycle touring, I tend to average 80, 90, if I push it, 100 kilometres per day, 160 kilometres a day when you're in potentially more challenging circumstances than just pootling around Europe, stopping at coffee bars and where have you. That is quite an achievement.
It was pretty grueling, and it very quickly became apparent that this wasn't a cycling touring holiday, that it really required, absolute dedication to the challenge. And we passed up so many wonderful opportunities that, when you're properly cycling touring, you'd have taken up and stopped places, seen things. But the only way that we could have completed this record was to be absolutely focused on that goal. And yeah, we acknowledged that we've missed out on a heck of a lot along the way, but all the more reason to go back and see it slower another time.
Now, in the extract that we heard earlier from the monologue that you did for the podcast, you talked about the fact that you'd done quite a bit of cycling, both on a bicycle and on a a tandem is still a bicycle. It's just it's got two seats rather than more than two wheels. You'd done quite a lot of touring on a bicycle, and you're also quite an experienced Audax cyclist. And there is an element of speed and time involved, as opposed to more general cycle touring. So you must have been pretty well prepared before you started. How confident were you feeling when you set off on the 5th of June 2022?
It's a really odd thing, and I think we had to plan to succeed, if that makes sense. So all our planning, we were really set on the 180 days, and all the planning focused around that. We'd got flights booked, everything, which probably came across as having quite a level of confidence. But I can remember riding out of the Brandenburg Gate and just thinking, oh my goodness, are we ever going to come back here? Never mind 6 months, can we even get around the world? It's such a long way and such a big challenge. And there were so many points along that trip where I think we really questioned, what we were doing and whether it's possible. But I think the thing was we stuck to that 180 days kind of through thick and thin, even halfway through. So halfway through we were in Australia, and at a point in Australia we were 6 days behind our target. So we had to essentially ride faster in the second half of the trip to make that up. But it's a bit indescribable. But for whatever reason, because we'd set ourselves this 180-day target, we kind of, the motivation to make that, I think, is what kept us going. I think if we hadn't had a goal, it would have been much easier to kind of slip and go slower and slower, or even, kind of not be as focused and not overcome the challenges we did, essentially.
Yeah, because basically, no, you weren't trying to beat anybody's record, which was set at 180 days. It was that kind of mythical 180 days. I suppose it's half a year. It's got an element of around the world in 180 days, not quite 80 days, but
it's not quite Mark Beaumont, but yeah, we like the ring to it.
Why did you choose Berlin to start in? Other people have started in Paris when they're going around the world. Berlin kind of seems a bit inconveniently north.
Well, we wanted to start on the continent in Europe anyway. We didn't really want to start from home. We wanted to avoid the Channel crossing. And actually, Jenny Graham, the female world record holder, started from the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. So Mark Beaumont's traditionally started from the Champs-Élysées in Paris. But I think that, that have had its own challenges. And I've spoken to Jenny quite a few times. So it's kind of a nod to her. As the female world record holder. And then handily as well, Stevie's brother lives very close to Berlin. So we knew we could get a ground crew out there to kind of wave us off and kind of give us the support kind of ahead of time. And we knew the city a bit as well. So I think that helped.
Because initially you're setting off and basically you're heading south rather than east. You head south through Germany and then Czechia into Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, before entering Turkey, at which point you're heading more east rather than south. To what extent did that first section just go to plan? I would have thought that perhaps Europe was the easiest in terms of following a preset plan to cycle.
It kind of was and kind of wasn't. I think Europe is interesting, as I'm sure many people listening to this podcast will know, because there are so many options. There are so many routes. So we diverted off our planned route pretty quickly, I think, in Czechia, where I can't remember if it was a Eurovelo route or not off the top of my head, but we were following kind of a set route, which was going to some beautiful places and lovely little kind of back roads even kind of tracky off-road sections. But from our point of view for speed at that point, we found we were gaining a lot more elevation, and with rougher road surfaces, we weren't able to make up the speed. So we diverted back onto main roads, which meant for less aesthetically pleasing cycling, but better speed. And then, we kind of mixed and matched as we went along. And it's very hard to get a feel for what a road or a route's like until you're actually on the ground, I think. I think you can look at all the maps you want and read all the accounts, but until you actually ride it, especially on something like a laden tandem, which isn't quite the same as, riding a lighter bike for sure, it's very hard to judge that. So Europe had its own challenges, definitely, and it felt a lot more familiar than a lot of places we cycled. But and as well, some of the most significant climbs came in Europe. Aside from Canada, it was going out and coming back into Europe was probably the hilliest legs as well, because there's a lot more places to find elevation in Europe than there is, say, in Southeast Asia.
I'm just looking at the map now, and you must have sighed a huge sigh of relief when you hit the Danube and suddenly started heading more east rather than heading south.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing. We're kind of aware of our direction, but we'd got the miles to do anyway, if that made sense. So we always had to get that mileage in somewhere. It was very nice to hit the Danube because we'd had a bit of climbing in and out of Czechia before that. But yeah, kind of that first long flat roll along the Danube, along I think EV6 at that point, felt like a bit of a breath of fresh air. But it's funny as well, going through Southeast Asia, for example, too. We couldn't travel east because of the nature of the curve of the continent. So we weren't always kind of 100% directionally east. We kind of moved, south and north as well. So it did kind of vary, but in some ways that was kind of good in terms of which way the wind was coming from and feeling like you were not always going the same way.
Yeah, it's probably worth at this point just clarifying what the rules are. From what I understand, you've got to set a record of cycling around the world. You've got to cycle 18,000 miles in an easterly or westerly direction. You can't double back, or if you do, those kilometers don't count. But you can break up the route. And if anybody looks at your map, they'll see, for example, that you get to Georgia and then the route continues in India. So could you just clarify what the rules are?
Yes, so you're quite correct. The minimum distance is 18,000 miles, and then you have to travel in the same direction longitudinally. So yes, you're not essentially. There are places where due to the curve of places, you're allowed a bit of leeway. The islands in New Zealand, for example, but it has to be within kind of a tolerance that Guinness approves. So we did have the route approved beforehand. You have to travel through 2 antipodal points, so that's opposite points on the planet. Ours were Wellington in Madrid and Algeciras in Spain, Wellington in New Zealand and Algeciras in Spain, just north of Madrid. That would make more sense. And then, I'm trying to think what else. I think that's essentially kind of the bare bones of it as well. But of course, you can't literally cycle around the world because there is a lot of water in between the land masses. So flights are permitted. Guinness does expect you to kind of ride as far as you can to the end of the leg. In Georgia, for example, Tbilisi, we'd actually hoped to continue through the stands. So we'd hoped to be able to ride through Azerbaijan and get the infamous Caspian Sea ferry. Before getting into Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan. But Azerbaijan, the land borders were still closed at that point. So we were unable to get through. So that's why we flew from Georgia. And then that was kind of quite a last minute change at that point. The only place we could then fly to was India. So we ended up extending the leg in India, which was a bit of a shame, really. But then I think, the stands would have been a very exciting place to go. It might be one for the bucket list of touring at a slower speed another time.
Was that, you said the land borders were closed, was that a COVID thing?
I think it sounded like it probably was, but there's quite a lot of problems there with Armenia as well at the moment. So I kind of wondered if it's a bit of a combination of the two, if that makes sense, because I think they were just a bit touchy kind of politically as well. So, and I certainly know that I think cyclists are still being turned back up to quite recently. I saw another cycle tourist that had almost got through, and no, they got turned back at that point. So the route through kind of the Middle East, middle of Europe, middle of Asia at the moment is really tricky, because obviously Russia's not an option either. And being UK passport holders, we had no options for Iran or anything like that. So in terms of circumnavigation, it's a tricky aspect at the moment.
Was COVID an issue anywhere? Were there any places you visited where, for example, you were inconvenienced because of the places you could visit or the conditions that you had to comply with?
No, we were really lucky, and it was essentially a massive risk we took, but it did kind of boil down to, well, if not now, when? So yeah, certainly, by the time we left the UK and there was still kind of mask wearing about. I think there's a bit of masks on the ferry to get across to Germany, but after that we didn't have any issues. I think the first time we then had to wear masks again was the flight to India, and they were quite adamant then that it was masks on the plane then. Then through all of India, absolutely nothing. I think they've got a very different view of COVID regulations out there. And then it came back in a bit in Southeast Asia, which I suppose wasn't a big surprise. But in terms of going to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, we were kind of aware of COVID regulations when we started the trip. So I think some of them even still had testing in place, PCR testing, when we left. And by the time we got there months later, they dropped all requirements. So we were actually incredibly lucky that, it's almost as we reached places, requirements got dropped, and we weren't inconvenienced by having to do anything extra.
By cutting short your plans in Georgia, in Tbilisi, you then presumably couldn't cover the distance that you wanted to in Azerbaijan and some of the other stands, perhaps. Did you then have to change your plans later in the trip to make up those missed miles?
Yeah, we did. So partly we did that in India. Originally, we were going to fly to New Delhi in India, and as it was, we flew to Ahmedabad and extended the leg by coming down further south on the continent. And then we were going to go right to the tip of India, but complications there as well kind of negated that. So we went further down south in India and then came up to the north, and then added distance. I think the majority of the distance was then we did kind of a bit more distance in Canada to ensure we kind of made up the miles to kind of hit the regulations, as it were.
And the other thing that's worth mentioning, perhaps in terms of the world record, is you have to fulfill quite stringent requirements in terms of getting evidence. Can you just talk through what evidence you needed to gather as you were cycling?
Yeah, so there's all sorts of things from basically the GPX files, so your ride track, as it were, that we were recording. So we had two devices recording at any one time to make sure we had a solid GPS track around the world, and that we had no kind of dropouts there. We did have a tracker as well, but that didn't actually contribute to the evidence, even though a lot of people kind of assumed it did. That wasn't kind of considered kind of a valid form. We had to get kind of time-stamped photos, so photos that would show you your date and location on. We had to get snippets of video from every day. We had a witness book that we got signed, so wherever we stayed and when we met people, we obtained signatures as proof of passage, kind of receipts or bank statements, hotel bookings, passport copies. I'm trying to think what else was in there now, but we've got this whole raft of evidence that it took me basically a month to get together after we got back to be able to submit that. So it's not just a case of kind of submitting your track and going, here you go. You still need to kind of evidence everything along the way as well.
I'm reminded of when I wrote my first book about cycling to Italy. I didn't keep anything because I didn't plan on writing a book. And even the maps, I used to cut the maps down as I stopped using them, and ended up, I remember, in southern Italy with just one little bit of map, and then regretted it when I got back and decided to write a book, because I had kind of, all these bits and pieces. So the second trip along the Mediterranean, I kept everything, because I thought in the back of my mind, I'm going to need this when I write the book. And I used to regularly, every week or so, send a pack back to the UK of all the maps and the bits and pieces that I gathered. And then more recently, as phones and the internet have got better, I just basically take a photo of everything. So I don't have to send things back to the UK, but I've still got the record. But presumably, you can't just photograph everything. You need the actual physical evidence that you'll need to send to Guinness when you get back. Is that correct?
No, most things were, so you're able to photograph receipts and things like that. That appears to be sufficient. And then the physical evidence was the logbook and the signatures, really. But then even then, that I've submitted electronically, so I've still got the physical logbook. But everything's submitted online nowadays, so it's a lot easier from that perspective. And having a mobile phone that automatically backed up everything up for me was just so much of a relief, that you're not having to carry around a digital camera or something like that everything instantly goes to a cloud and is safe, and you're not risking losing everything. Even the video footage all got backed up along the way as well, which was another job. But it meant that we knew everything was safe, and that we couldn't have any disasters where we lost everything.
Yeah, I can just imagine you kind of having to, I don't know, buy a trailer in India just to stick all the receipts and the maps and the evidence in, and drag that around the world with you as well.
Yeah, I think if you look at records going back a few years, that maybe not quite at that moment, but I'm sure others have kind of collected rafts of receipts and things like that, and kind of come back with big rolls of. But I think this day and age, that because everything's submitted electronically as well, it's a lot easier.
So getting to the trip itself, how were you travelling? What was your style? Were you in 5-star hotels? Were you hosteling? Were you camping? Were you wild camping? How much kit were you taking with you?
So we were set up for camping. So we've got 4 panniers on the bike, so 2 front, 2 back, and then a couple of frame bags. And the front panniers kind of contain the camping kit. We had hoped to be able to camp more, so we did camp a bit in Europe. I think. Oh no, we did do some wild camping in Australia as well. So we did little bits of wild camping. I've been meaning to total up the number of days we camped, but I would guess it might be less than a dozen in total. So it wasn't proportionally that much at all. Options for camping in India were just negligible, and same for Southeast Asia, that accommodation was so cheap it wasn't worth it. And with the climate, it would have just been entirely uncomfortable. And then kind of Australia, when we started Australia, it was unseasonably cold, so that put us off to begin with. And then we did do a bit of camping there. By the time we got to the end of Australia, Stevie had developed some quite nasty saddle sores. So that kind of put us off camping as well, with just the need to kind of get clean and comfortable every night. And then through Canada as well, we had some very cold temperatures there. So I think there's one point in Canada where it just warmed up a bit, and we were like, maybe we could consider camping again. We'd been all through the Rockies at this point, which we're kind of aware was kind of on the top areas of their territory, as it were. And quite sadly, we passed a young bear that had obviously been hit by a car on the side of the road, but it kind of made us think again that actually, this is still bear territory, and that's something we're very much not used to. So, yeah, the bears put us off a bit in Canada as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting point regarding Canada. You presumably were in Canada October and November time. Were you not tempted to take a more southerly route through the US, bearing in mind you were cycling during winter?
Yeah, we did look at the US, and we had some problems getting visas around the COVID restrictions, and it became complicated essentially. So it was almost to be on the safe side that Canada had just proved easier for us. I think we got less elevation through the Rockies and things like that. So it was a bit of a touch and go in terms of the climate, but as it was, it kind of worked out okay. And yeah, we had a tough time there, but yeah, across the prairies, we got some amazing tailwinds, and I think that was some of the fastest days of the trip. So it did work out okay.
How many days were you planning in advance? Were you able to, look forward a week, say, and plan roughly where you were going to be, or was it a very much day by day thing?
It did boil down to day by day. At some points I'd be looking 3 days ahead for kind of accommodation and options, but essentially I'd often be booking things in the morning for that evening, particularly in Canada. This is another development of technology. I think that I could have an app on my phone to book accommodation, and basically suss something out. I could check the facilities, hit a button, and it was booked for that evening, and you'd turn up and they'd be expecting you. So I think with those developments in technology, it was kind of like, well, what's the worst, what's the risk of not making a distance on a certain day? And it kind of meant that we were able to kind of plan things a bit more flexibly, especially when we were finding it tough and finding it hard, that trying to commit to a certain number of miles for the next 3 days, if the weather changed, if there's a headwind, or even if there's tailwind and we're going faster, being able to book accommodation kind of the morning for that evening allowed us a lot more flexibility.
So just getting back to the route, so from Georgia, you fly to northern India to Ahmedabad, and then you head basically down along the coast of India, right down to the tip of India, and then turn around basically and head northeast along the coast in the direction of Bangladesh. You then pick up the route again in Thailand, and you head through Thailand, Malaysia, and from there you head over to Perth by the looks of it, and then around the southern coast mainly of Australia until you get to Melbourne, and then you head inland up to Brisbane, and then you do a little, well, I say a little bit, it's probably quite a long bit. It's the northern island of New Zealand, and then you fly over to, am I correct? Is that Vancouver, and then head across Canada. What were the highlights of that trip?
So it was hard because a lot of it was kind of so tough. So some of the highlights were some of the toughest bits as well. The Rockies in Canada were absolutely amazing, but you can probably imagine that was literally the high point of the trip in terms of elevation. So there were some very, very hard days riding there, but the scenery was just absolutely kind of immense and stunning. And similarly, New Zealand as well was extremely beautiful, but we were there a very short space of time, and I think that was the part where we kind of most felt like we were missing out on a lot of things, because you could see that there was obviously wonderful places to go visit there, and we just didn't have the opportunity to stop. And then some places as well we had other problems going on, so we still had a bit of kind of sickness in Thailand and things like that, which in a way didn't ruin it as such, but definitely didn't make things easy, and we didn't necessarily enjoy it as much as we'd have hoped to.
What are the extra challenges of being on a tandem that you don't perhaps have when you're cycling a one-seated bike, a one-person bike? I'm just, for example, thinking there are occasions when I've been cycle touring and you get to a stupidly designed stile or gate, and basically you just kind of shrug and you think, oh God, here we go again, and you haul your bike over, and you can probably do it usually without taking the panniers off, and then you just kind of spend a few minutes being grumpy about the person who designed it. But if you're on a tandem, you kind of, there are a lot of obstacles that I would imagine are a lot more problematic.
Yeah, and we've certainly had that experience in the UK of all places, riding the tandem before. It's been all panniers off and the bike up in the air and everything. But we avoided that on this trip, I think partly because we were on roads a lot of the time, and particularly outside of Europe there's so few kind of cycle tracks and paths. And we did encounter some in, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, but in Asia, for example, they were just pretty much non-existent. So we were on the roads then, in which case most of the time that meant we were able to move quite well. But If we got bad road surfaces, for example, that could be a big issue. The tandem, the weight on the back wheel, because it's essentially two people's weight on one back wheel, is always something that we needed to be very much aware of, because if that breaks, we're not going anywhere. So and then the maneuverability and the handling was a real big challenge for Stevie. So he was having to kind of ensure that we stayed safe and the bike stayed safe a lot of the time.
Did you have a tandem? I'm just looking at a picture of it now. Was your tandem custom built, or had you had it for a long time beforehand?
No, it's very much custom built for the trip. So we were riding a wonderful old aluminium doors Galaxy tandem prior to this, but for the flights and for the trip, we needed to be able to split the tandem. So it's couple tandem, and it's got two sets of coupling to enable us to split it in half, so that we could box it up for the flights. So it's actually a custom build by CoMotion that kind of sponsored us with the custom build as well. Because if you see the photos of me and Stevie stood next to each other, we've got quite a difference in height. So having it fitted, to each of our frames was a massive benefit, and it's an absolutely stunning bike. It was built by the Tandem shop in Telford, and we couldn't have asked for better, really.
Yeah, because I'm just looking now. The top bar is actually quite an angle. Is that because obviously Steve is a lot taller than you, and you're a lot shorter, and basically you both needed to reach the pedals?
Yeah. So the back half is quite a tight angles. Yeah, because I'm much smaller than he is. So it was literally custom built frame to our dimensions, which was I don't think we ever thought we'd own a bike like that, but for the purpose of such a big trip, it was made all the difference.
Yeah, and those couplings, I've seen them before on tandems, but they've got to be really good quality, haven't they? Because basically you're breaking your frame, and the frame is obviously fundamental to having an effective bike, but you're breaking your frame in effect and creating a weak point. So those couplings, they've got to be pretty robust and dependable.
And they're fab as well. They obviously got a really good and robust design. They kind of interlock with each other before you screw them kind of together. So there's no kind of chance of shifting a movement there. Required very little kind of maintenance and were essential to split the bike up. So they worked a treat essentially.
So am I correct in thinking, bearing in mind what you've just said, that you really didn't have any mechanical problems with the bike, but you did have other problems? What were they?
Well, we did have a few mechanicals. Probably, I mean, Stevie does a fantastic job as a bike mechanic. So he maintained the bike all the way around the world, and the bike itself never went into a bike shop. He did all the maintenance and kind of kept on top of everything. And it was only in the back end of the trip we had because of course the components are not necessarily tested to the levels we're riding them, so nobody knows necessarily how long each of the components are going to last, and we kind of tested them to destruction. So we got to the back end of Canada, and we had the free hub basically wear out on us. So the little springs in there that kind of keep the pulls engaged so the wheel turns, they had basically disintegrated. So we were pedaling and nothing was happening because we weren't engaged with the wheel. So that was, we had to source an emergency new free hub at the back end of Canada. And then within about 24 hours of getting to the Brandenburg Gate, and bearing in mind we'd kind of worked extremely hard to make this 180-day target by that point, the rear wheel bearings went as well. So the bearings in the rear wheel collapsed on us too. So that was another kind of last minute sourcing of parts and a bit of a bit of stress at the end.
But you did have an accident, or you were involved in an accident. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that was a real point at which we, the trip would have ended, it would have been there, I think, because that was it was horrible. That was in Malaysia, and basically I didn't know anything about it until I felt a massive impact from behind, and next thing I knew we were luckily in a grass verge, but there was a couple of kids racing about on motorcycles. And if you've been to Malaysia, you'll know it's a bit lawless on the roads there. So they just, they go whatever speed, they mess about, and they're not wearing any kind of protective clothing. And I think they were just racing their mates. They didn't see us and ploughed into the back of us. And we were very, very lucky to get away relatively unscathed. I had some quite badly bruised ribs, and we'd got some fairly nasty cuts and scrapes, but it was pretty scary. And the panniers on the right hand side of the bike were actually ripped off the bike, and we kind of had to collect them from about 50 meters up the road. So that was kind of force we were hit with, and the panniers essentially saved us. I think acted like airbags, but so two of the panniers were kind of completely destroyed by being sheared off the bike. And we then had the challenge of having to source new ones and figure out how to carry the kit in the meantime. So that was a bit of an ordeal, because it made us really weigh up the safety of things. And luckily we were kind of only, I think, 3 days out from Singapore airport by that point. So we knew that we were, going to be out of Asia and into Australia, and things would seem a lot different. But I think if that had happened earlier on in that leg, I think it would have really kind of shaken us up a bit.
Did you come close to thinking, Anna, this is not worth it?
Yeah, I think we did. We really we had that conversation of, from a safety point of view, is it worth, kind of risking life and limb to do this? It was at that point. But we managed to kind of we managed to construct some bags and get back on, and kind of limped our way to Singapore at that point. By the time, we had to get to an airport to get out of there anyway. We did the option to go to Kuala Lumpur as well, but we kind of thought might as well go to Singapore. And by the time we'd done that, it was kind of like, well, we might as well at least get to Australia and start and keep going from there.
Again, comparing it to solo cycle touring, one of the nice things, it's a double-edged thing, but one of the nicer things, I think, is that basically there's nobody to argue with or nobody to fall out with. If you're in a tandem, you're with somebody all the time and you can't escape them. Did you get on well?
I think we did on the whole. I mean, it would be untruthful to say that we didn't have days where we were both particularly grumpy, and we did, because of the nature of the trip. It was trying, and we couldn't be on top of the moon all the time. So there were one or two kind of not fallings out, as it were, but I think we both knew deep down that was more to do with the level of what we were doing than us actually kind of disagreeing over any component of the trip. We were both kind of on the same page in terms of what we were doing. We just might have not had the best attitude at times. And I think that could be said for both of us. But I mean, the beauty of tandem riding is that it keeps you together. We didn't have that option of one of us riding off on our own bike, and it meant that it had to be absolutely, devoted to the teamwork. And we both kind of developed very specific roles. So as mentioned, Steve was in charge of like the bike and the maintenance. I'd be kind of more in charge of sourcing the food and doing the routing and kind of the finding hotels, logistics like that. And we kind of balanced everything out. And I think having that sense of shared responsibility was, part of the secret to our success, as it were.
Yeah, I was going to say, did you have a kind of a pre-trip agreement whereby you agreed to do certain things in certain circumstances? And were there any kind of clauses in that contract which said, look, if at any point we have a really big argument, this is what we're going to do?
Not so much formally. I think because we've travelled so much together before, and we've done various trips, tandem and solo before, we kind of know how we work and where our strengths lie. So, Steve is pretty obvious that, because I'd done all the routing beforehand, and I'm very much into the organisation and logistics, that my strengths lay there. So that was that kind of all fell to me. And then because he is the one that is on the front of the bike, so he's having to kind of take all that stress and all that mental energy of handling the bike, steering the bike, driving the bike. And it's not so much that I've got my feet up on the back, I still have to pedal, but I've not got the involvement of that kind of mental energy of actually steering the bike, that I tried to take on what roles I could to take the pressure off him. particularly towards the back of Canada. He suffered a knee injury and things like that. So he's really needing to maximise his rest and recovery of an evening. And that might mean that I had to go out and do the shopping, as it were, of an evening, come back and cook it while he was resting. But I think that was all very much part of the deal. And I think it was this attitude that we can't succeed as individuals here. Either two of us are going back through the Brandenburg Gate or none of us are. It had to be both of us. And it's a stipulation of Guinness as well that we couldn't just substitute somebody else in there. But it was, unless we came through as a team, we weren't going to succeed. So we had to maintain that focus of teamwork and kind of, we never had a kind of any kind of pact of, what if we have a massive disagreement. I think it was no, we've got to do this as a team.
So you arrive in Halifax, the one, not where I am, but the one in Canada.
The other one, yeah.
You arrive in Halifax in Nova Scotia, and then you fly down to Lisbon. What date did you arrive in Lisbon?
I believe it was the 15th of November, I think. So we had about, approximately 2 weeks in Europe.
Right, so you arrived and you're obviously wanting to break this 180-day barrier. Were you able to, when you got to Lisbon, were you able to kind of sit back and relax a little bit, thinking, oh, we've got plenty of time, or were you still quite conscious of the clock ticking away?
Oh, because no, we were still very conscious, and I think we had to average 115 miles a day through the back end of Europe to get to the Brandenburg Gate and to still cover the distance we needed to. So we still had a lot to do, and it was a very surreal thing. We got to Lisbon and we got all these messages, wonderful messages of support of people going, oh, you're nearly there, you've done it, you've cracked it, you're back in Europe, it's just this last little bit. And it completely didn't feel like that to us. We still had 1,800 miles to go. So it was still, in the realms of the distance from Land's End to John O'Groats and back again, which is massive. And it was only in proportion to everything else we'd done that it didn't look as far. But we had some horrendous weather in Spain, some climbing there, and we had one evening where it's just been absolutely torrential, and then kind of got into France but very late, and then France had its own issues as well. I think we had a bit of bad weather there, and it just, the challenges kept on coming and coming. And then, right up until the end, having, we had I think about 72 hours out from the end, we had another day of horrendous weather and very, very cold as well. And Stevie actually got hypothermic. So we had to stop early that day to warm him up. And then it was the following day that the wheel bearings went. So it really was right up to the last minute. It was like, I still wouldn't have been able to bet that we could have come in on the 100. It might have been, 181, 182, but it wasn't clear cut that we were going to get in on, before day 180 until we actually did it, I think. And that took getting up at, I think we got in at midnight that night to the hotel, got to bed at 1, and then we got up at 4 a.m. to enable us to get in with good time on that day. So it really was a challenge to the last.
And when you arrived at the Brandenburg Gate again, was there a big party? Were there people waiting there for you to get back, or was it kind of, oh, right, okay, we've done it, let's get on our flight?
There were people waiting, and they were very, very dedicated people, because we actually rode into the Brandenburg Gate in a blizzard. And it was absolutely freezing, horrendous weather. And we've got friends and family there, but they were all kind of like huddled round, shivering and shaking. And we did have a big cheer and a big, there were people kind of cheering us in. But once we'd done that, and once we'd got the video footage and the photos we needed and the witnesses' statement signed, it was very much like, right, get straight to the hotel, get in the warm. And everybody by that point, I think, needed to warm up, because it was absolutely Baltic. We kind of made the best of a very cold situation, I'd say.
Now, I'm sure that you would love to keep the record forevermore, but if anybody did want to break your record of 175 days, what would be your advice to that couple, male, female, male and female, whoever it was, because basically you hold all the records? What would be your advice?
Yeah, it's tricky because I think you've got to go into it with absolute commitment to the record, and it was not a holiday. It very quickly became apparent that, one of the biggest not disappointments, but downsides was that we didn't have those options to stop. We had to pass so much by, and we had to take the busier main roads or the less scenic main roads when you could see that there would be wonderful places to go off and tour. And the only way we were able to do that was to kind of make ourselves, promise that we'd come back to places one day. But it was all about the challenge, and it took that level of commitment. So if somebody wanted to go for it, I think good on them. But I think people, I'm following people out there now that are traveling the world by tandem and they're having a wonderful time, and I can see all these fantastic videos, but I think people would have to accept that you won't be able to kind of necessarily do any of that, that you have to be absolutely focused on the goal.
And when you came back, because am I right? You work for a vet, is that correct?
I'm a veterinary surgeon. Yeah.
What does Stevie do? What's his job?
He's house husband at the moment, so he's currently not working. He kind of gave up work before we made the preparations for this trip, so we're still kind of settling back into normal life.
So what's it like coming back after such a long period away and readjusting and getting back into life and jobs and things like that?
Yeah, it's been pretty strange, particularly because we came back right before Christmas. So it felt like we rolled into Christmas in no time at all. And, it was very hard to try and get, I don't think I wrapped up a single present this year, for example. So many apologies to friends and family who have kind of neglected. But it's, we're kind of settling down now. We're into January, and I've been doing kind of a few kind of shifts on and off. But it's very strange, and it's, we kind of can't quite believe that we've done all this. We can't believe that this has happened. And in some ways, coming back to familiarity is very nice, but in other ways it feels very surreal that we've been through all this amazing experience. And you've suddenly got to get back to kind of normal life and worry about things like going to the shops and paying bills and all the things that we've kind of blissfully been ignorant of for 6 months.
So what next? What's your next adventure going to be?
Nothing like this ever again. I think this is our Everest. There's no way to kind of beat this or surmount this. And as well, it's been incredibly expensive as well. So it's been the trip of a lifetime. And as I've kind of mentioned, if we do anything, I think it will be at a much slower pace. And we're very keen, especially Europe, actually, we're very keen to go back cycle touring in Europe, closer to home, avoid any long distance flights, and kind of enjoy it.
Which bit of the trip do you think, if you were, say, given 2 weeks to go back and revisit, which bit would you go back and revisit?
I think it would be somewhere around Europe. So either, both ends actually. Portugal was super friendly, Spain really interesting, France, I think we could easily lose ourselves for 2 weeks in France, but also Eastern Europe as well. Romania, Bulgaria were really lovely places. So I think, having gone through all the stress of flying with a tandem and being further afield, I think we would actually be happy to stay quite close to home.
Okay, well, thank you for that. If people want to kind of visit your website and your social media, where can they find you?
We're www.stellatandem.com. We're Stella Tandem it's with one L because it's Stevie and Laura on social media as well. And we've raised a tremendous amount of money for charity through the trip as well. So we're really proud of that. So if anybody did want to put a few pennies in the tin as well, we'd never say no. So be great if anybody wants to keep, because we're still kind of putting out a bit of content and things like that too. So if people still want to follow us along, that'd be fantastic.
Okay, well, thank you for agreeing to take part again. It's nice to have the before and after. It's nice to contrast. I'm sure when I listen back to this, I'll listen to what you said now in the original monologue with a different kind of hat on. But it's interesting to have that perspective before and afterwards. But thank you for taking part, and good luck on your future tandem travels.
Thank you so much.
And that has been episode 64 of the Cycling Europe podcast. Thank you to Laura Massey-Pugh for having come back to tell us all about her record-breaking round-the-world tandem cycle with her husband Stevie. If you'd like to go back and listen to that original episode, number 32, you can do so by visiting cyclingeurope.org/podcast. If you'd like to submit your own monologue or be one of the people interviewed on the podcast, please get in contact. You can find all the contact details at cyclingeurope.org/contact. And if you'd like to support the podcast financially, then please do so by visiting cyclingeurope.org/support, and you'll find all the links which will enable you to do just that. And to all those people who've done that in the past, thank you very much indeed. It certainly makes the podcast a more sustainable operation. I'll be back with episode 65 of the podcast very soon, so keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, thank you for listening. Thank you to Rob Ainsley for providing the excellent music once again, and happy cycling.